is not simply the way life comes to us, but is the way all things really exist. In these talks, I've had to say a good deal about prayer. And before going on to my main subject tonight, I'd like to deal with a difficulty some people find about the whole idea of prayer. Somebody put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I can't swallow is this idea of him listening to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I find quite a lot of people feel that difficulty.
Hello, my name's Steve Turner. We're studying Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I'm glad you're with us today. This is the second lesson in our series. And just a little recap. This book, Mere Christianity, written by C.S. Lewis, was written during World War II. It was first aired as a series of radio programs on BBC with the purpose of C.S. Lewis explaining what it means to be a Christian. What is Christianity? So in our first lesson, we covered some of his first chapters where he presented this idea, this law of human nature, this law of right and wrong, of human decency. And basically, he showed that this is, there are two things going on here. First of all, there appears to be this law of human nature, which is the difference between good and evil. There is something such as good and evil. The second part of this is that we as human beings know this. It's embedded in us, but our behavior is not always consistent with that. In other words, we fall short. And so he starts that out because he's laying the foundation basically for what Christianity is and why it exists. And so he's moving in a direction. Again, in the first lesson, we talked about C.S. Lewis being a master of logic. He's using his rational thinking to lay out a case, so to speak. So he's moving towards something, and we're going to see in this lesson what he's moving towards. So we start this with the section called The Reality of the Law. That's the little chapter that we're going to be reading from. And again, I would encourage you to get a book, Mere Christianity. It looks like that, at least my paperback does, and read along with us as we move through this book. So again, this is starting chapter 3, and this would be under the title of the section would be, the title here is Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. So what we're moving towards is, what is the meaning of the universe? Okay? So let's start. I now go back to what I said at the end of the first chapter, that there were two odd things about the human race. First, that they were haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice, whether you call it fair play or decency or morality or the law of nature. Second, that they did not, in fact, do so. So again, the laws of nature, as applied to stones or trees, may only mean what nature in fact does. But if you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behavior, it is a different matter. That law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do. For as I said before, many of them do not obey this law at all, and none of them obey it completely. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. In other words, when you're dealing with humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts. You have the facts, how humans behave, and you also have something else, how they ought to behave. In the rest of the universe, there need not be anything but the facts. Electrons and molecules behave in a certain way, and certain results follow, and that may be the whole story. But men behave in a certain way, and that is not the whole story. For all the time you know they ought to behave differently. Now, this is really peculiar that one might be tempted to try and explain it away. For instance, we might try to make out when you say a man ought to not to act as he does, you only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape. Namely, what he does happens to be inconvenient to you, but that is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in a train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man and do not blame the first. So again, there's this thing deep inside us that it's a standard. It's a standard that guides society, or it should, and when we don't follow that standard, we usually get in trouble, okay? Both as individuals and societies. Men ought to be unselfish, ought to be fair. Not that men are unselfish, nor that they like being unselfish, but that they ought to be. The moral law, or the law of human nature, is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way as the law of gravitation is, or maybe simply a fact about how heavy objects behave. On the other hand, it is not a mere fancy, for we cannot rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. And is not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience. For the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient, and maybe even the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow be other than a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. And yet it is not a fact in the ordinary sense, in the same way as our actual behavior is a fact. It begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality, that in this particular case there's something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and quite definitely real, a real law which none of us has made, but which we find pressing on us. So what lies behind this law? Where does it come from? What is it? In the case of man, we saw the law of human nature, or of right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behavior. In this case, besides the actual facts, you have something else, a real law which we did not invent and which we know we ought to obey. I now want you to consider what this tells us about the universe we live in. Ever since men were able to think that they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be. And very roughly, two views have been held. First, there's what is called the materialist view. People who take that view think that matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed, nobody knows why, and that the matter behaving in certain fixed ways has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. By one chance in 1,000, something hit our sun and made it produce the planets. And by another 1,000th chance, the chemicals necessary for life and the right temperature occurred on one of these planets. And so some of the matter on this earth came alive. And then by a very long series of chances, the living creatures developed in things like us. The other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and it has purposes and prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe, partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean, like itself to the extent of having minds. Please do not think that one of these views was held a long time ago and the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up, And note this, you cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. And he talks about science and what it can do and what it can't do. So what is this something behind the universe? So the idea here is there's two ways of looking at this universe. One, it just happened. Probability, we know in scientific terms, some things have a very low chance of happening. And really physics and biology and other things tell us that probabilities are an important aspect of science. So we should consider that. So to get a human being, the probability we hypothesize, would be very low. So the materialist view says that that's all good and fine, but that happened. Whether the probability was low or not, it happened. The other view is what he calls the religious view, and that basically says there's something beyond the universe. There's something bigger. There's something bigger than what we know. He follows this up with saying, what evidence do we have? In other words, what do we have on either the materialist side or the religious side? This something that exists beyond man, that has this ability and this desire to create a universe that includes the earth, that includes all the things on this earth, that it also includes mankind. He says, well, to know this would be very difficult because we don't have the external evidence. There's one thing we do have, though. There is one thing, and only one, in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. That one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. And because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law which they did not make and cannot quite forget even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey. Notice the following point. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get inside information from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we would have this moral law. How could he? For his observations would only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. In the same way, if there were anything above and behind the observed facts in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from outside, could never hope to discover it. The position of the question, then, is like this. We want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. So that's the essential question. Suppose someone asked me when I see a man in a blue uniform going down the street leaving little paper packets at each house, why I suppose that they contain letters. I should reply, because whenever he leaves a little packet for me, I find it does contain a letter. And if he then objected, but you've never seen all these letters which you think the other people are getting, I would say, of course not. And I shouldn't expect to, because they're not addressed to me. I'm explaining the packets I'm allowed to open by the ones I'm explaining the packets I'm not allowed to open by the ones I'm allowed to open. It is the same about this question. The only packet I'm allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. But I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of the letters, in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. Let's stop there. So he's progressing forward with this argument or making this case that the universe includes us as humans. And there's something inside us that gives us this yearning, so to speak. Maybe yearning is not the right word. It gives us this sense of right and wrong. And it gives us a sense of this is how we should behave, but we don't behave. Where did that come from? Well, he makes the case it comes from something bigger than us. It comes from this, what he calls a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. Now, this is a long way, he says. Do not think I'm going faster than I really am. I'm not yet within 100 miles of the God of Christian theology. All I have got to do is a something which is directing the universe and which appears in me as a law urging me to do right and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. I think we have to assume it is more like a mind than it is anything else we know, because after all, the only other thing we know is matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions. But of course, it need not to be very like a mind, and still less like a person. In the next chapter, we shall see if we can find anything more about this. But one word of warning. There's been a great deal of soft soap talked about God for the last 100 years. That is not what I'm offering to you. So he comes up, he's moving towards this idea there's something out there, and he's making the case that it created not only the universe, but it also created us and this earth. Now again, as Christians, we have a Bible, and we know if we believe in the Bible, that's told to us from the very beginning. But he's not there yet. He says, I'm 100 miles from there. So just hang on. All right. So where's he going? I ended my last chapter with the idea that in the moral law, somebody or something from beyond the material universe was actually getting at us. And I expect when I reached that point, some of you felt a certain annoyance. You may even thought that I'd played a trick on you, that I'd been carefully wrapping up to look like philosophy what turns out to be more religion. You may have felt you were ready to listen to me as long as you thought I had anything new to say. But if it turns out to be only religion, well, the world has tried that, and you cannot put that clock back. If anyone is feeling that way, too bad. He says, first of all, we have not yet got as far as the God of any actual religion, still less the God of that particular religion called Christianity. We have only got as far as somebody or something behind the moral law. We have two bits of evidence about the somebody. One is the universe he's made. If we use that as our only clue, then I think we should have to conclude that he was a great artist. For the universe is a very beautiful place, but also that he was quite merciless and no friend to man, for the universe is a very dangerous and terrifying place. The other bit of evidence is that moral law, which is put into our hands, into our minds. And this is the better bit of evidence than the other because it is inside information. You find out more about God from the moral law than from the universe in general, just as you find out more about a man by listening to his conversation than by looking at a house he has built. Now, from this second bit of evidence, we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, and truthfulness. The point here is that our own existence gives us evidence of the existence of God. Now that could be seen as a, infinite loop, so to speak. But we know that there's something inside us that tells us right and wrong. And then we have to ask ourselves, where did that come from? And how does that relate to the bigger universe and to those outside us. We cannot do without it, and we cannot do with it. God is the only comfort. He is also the supreme terror, the thing we most need and the thing we most want to hide from. He is our only possible ally, and we have made ourselves his enemies. Some people talk as if meeting the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. They need to think again. They are still only playing with religion. Goodness is either the great safety or the great danger, according to the way you react to it. And we have reacted the wrong way. I'm not trying to play any trick on you. I had a different reason. My reason was that Christianity simply does not make sense until you have faced the sort of facts I've been describing. Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who do not know they have done anything to repent of and who do not feel they need any forgiveness. It is after you have realized that there is a real moral law and a power behind the law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power. It is after all this, and not a moment sooner, that Christianity begins to talk. When you know you are sick, you will listen to a doctor. When you have realized that our position is nearly desperate, you will begin to understand what the Christians are talking about. They offer an explanation how we got into our present state of both hating goodness and loving it. They offer an explanation of how God can be this impersonal mind at the back of the moral law and yet also a person. They tell you how the demands of this law, which you and I cannot meet, have been met on our behalf, how God himself becomes a man to save man from the disapproval of God. It is an old story, and if you want to go into it, you will no doubt consult people who have more authority to talk about it than I have. All I am doing is to ask people to face the facts, to understand the questions Christianity claims to answer. And they are very terrifying facts. I wish it was possible to say something more agreeable, but I must say what I think true. Of course, I quite agree that the Christian religion is in the long run a thing of unspeakable comfort. But it does not begin in comfort. It begins in the dismay I've been describing. And it is no use at all trying to go on to that comfort without going through that dismay. In religion, as in war and everything else, comfort is the one thing you can not get by looking for it. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth. Only soft soap and wistful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. Most of us have gotten over the pre-war wishful thinking about international politics. It is time we did the same about religion. What does he mean by that last sentence there? Most of us have gotten over the pre-war wishful thinking about international politics. It is time we did the same about religion. Well, the context of this was there was a war between Germany and the British, and it included a lot of others too, both on the German side and the British side. But basically, C.S. Lewis is saying the Nazis are evil. We should have recognized that early. We didn't, and now we're paying the price. So one of the issues here, if you know there is a right and wrong, we want to be on the side of right, of the righteous. And we also want to be aware of evil. And when there is evil, we must stand up against it. All right, this concludes the first section on right and wrong and the meaning of the universe. And what C.S. Lewis comes down on the side of is there is this law of human nature, right and wrong. There is a universe, and there is a God who made that universe. So that's where we'll end this lesson today. And I hope you have a good day, and see you the next time. Thank you.